Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome, everyone, to this Peak Prosperity Podcast. I am your host, Chris Martenson, and it is June 27th, 2018. Now, I've written a number of pieces lately that have been kind of off the reservation from describing the world through the economic lens. That's often a lens that I look through. And recently, I have a set of pieces. There's really a trio, and one of them was fully public and was called Facing Our Horrible Future. And that one really was just looking at extrapolating the trends we're facing right now. And if we carried those forward and we went out to 2040 and then looked back, would we be proud of ourselves or have regrets? Well, if we lost all the megafauna of the world and trashed our ecosystems, we might look back with a lot of regret. That was the point of that piece. It really caught a lot of traction, and it really got widely circulated, and I got a lot of feedback from that. And so encouraged by that, I wrote another piece called The End of Growth, which really looks at the fact that we need to face up to this fact that growth can't be infinite. And that seems like a very obvious statement. And yet it's rather controversial still in some circles. And then there was a off-the-cuff podcast, which I did for my subscribers, where I just free-formed, it's off the cuff, and really went into looking at the demoralization that people are reporting, the senses of isolation and disconnection, and beginning to connect some dots around that story. And so I want to continue that today. We're going to have a very, very amazing podcast today, and I have with me today Charles Hugh Smith. You know him as the author of the Of Two Minds blog, and a prolific author of many books, and as well sometimes a contributing editor at Peak Prosperity. So Charles, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Chris. Well, I was very excited by the engagement of the Peak Prosperity community in your last, several two-part essays and your off-the-cuff, A New Framework for the Future. And so, and as a participant, I'm very interested to hear your kind of summary of the feedback that and the discussions that your off the cuff created in the community.
Well, certainly, here's one way I measure it. When people who've been registered and or subscribed for many years finally come up and come up for air and maybe post their first ever comment, or maybe their 10th in one a year. So I measure it in terms of people coming out who normally aren't actively engaged in the commenting community. And this time, people said, hey, this one really hit home. This one really landed. This feels right, even if it doesn't feel great to ponder this. And if I was going to summarize them, I think it's really what I'm detecting. And again, I might be that guy who just bought a Prius, so all I see is Priuses on the road, right? But my confirmation bias, notwithstanding, what I'm noticing, Charles, is that more and more people are feeling very isolated, very worried, very disconnected, and that runs in stark opposition to what I'm going to call the economic propaganda that's out there. That the story of the economic propaganda is, hey, it's all good, multi-decade lows and unemployment claims and unemployment itself and on and on. But the truth is, people are feeling really stressed, really unhappy, really, in many cases, that there's something deeply wrong with the story. And I think that in order to understand that, why things are so deeply wrong with the story, what you have to do, what anybody has to do, not you, but all of us, what we have to do is see that larger picture and understand that demoralization happens when your cognitive map doesn't match the reality anymore, when you no longer feel like you have any hope or there's something deeply wrong in your story. And so more and more people are reporting that. And I think it makes sense if you just track what's happening ecologically and you say, well, why should I get all excited about, building a huge career and going down the consumer pathway if the entire world, if this is my point of view, if I'm holding the point of view that the entire world might be trashed. it's really hard to get excited about participating in that, and so that might be an explanation that we might want to look for. And, we could rotate that Rubik's Cube and say, well, just economically, what's happened as a matter of policy in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world is that the very, very wealthy have been handed basically free, risk-free wealth by the central banks. And of course, they don't create wealth. They redistribute it. So they took it from everybody, gave it to the few. And maybe you find that rather unfair and unsettling on some level. So however we want to look at this, that's really what I was trying to poke at in that series. And I think people responded and said, well poked, you got me with that one. And so I want to really discuss with you, that problem definition stage, it's there, but it's meaningless. And this was the real point of what I was going on about in the off-the-cuff pieces. Unless we have a narrative, a framework for action that we can take, it doesn't help to sort of poke at that demoralization. It might even be cruel. So, this is really where I want to take this conversation today is saying, okay, given what we're seeing in the world, what can we do about it? What should we do about it? And how can I personally participate in that?
Yeah. And there's so many things I want to say about your off the cuff, but let's start with that because I think that's the core. And my comment in that thread, which was filled with very significant, meaningful, lengthy commentaries from other people in the community. Mm-hmm. And it was just like I was like a sponge just soaking up all this sort of insight and personal experience that people were sharing. But I guess my main takeaway and what I was trying to comment on in the thread was why we're so crippled and demoralized is partly because we've lost so many opportunities that used to exist a few decades ago for social engagement. In other words, there was layers of social organization that were not run by the government. In other words, they weren't like state imposed. They were part of the social fabric. And these were social organizations and community groups and that kind of thing. And so without that organizational structure, it's very difficult to act, on your own. It's really hard to organize something from scratch. It's a huge effort. Yeah. The learning curve and everything is just gigantic, and you run across a lot of crazies. And I mean, I've done the whole thing. Okay, I've mm-hmm. joined, I've contributed, and I've tried to start stuff. And starting stuff is like 2 orders of magnitude more difficult than joining something that's already functioning. And I want to comment about what makes an organization function. And number one is there are positive social roles for the people who join it. In other words, you could be unemployed, you could be at a low point in your family, happiness. You could have a lot of things going wrong in your life. But when you show up for that organizational meeting, people brighten. Hey, you're here. We need you. Your contribution is important. Look at what we've accomplished so far this week on our project. It just makes an enormous difference in your life, and your demoralization goes away, at least while you're participating in that community group that's got positive social roles.
It was interesting at this offsite I just attended, which was a blue sky session to talk about the future of work. Super diverse audience there participating in this exercise. 4 of them were high-level ex-military, and they had very interesting roles. One was a biochemist for the Army and so on. And they all reported that same thing that Sebastian Junger was talking about in Tribes, which you're touching on right now, which was that when they were in the military, and these were all ex-military, it was clear what their roles were, how they fit, what their contributions were. And they had a real sense, too, that, one woman was talking about her experience in the Army, and she said, in the Army, they would put you in a new role and fully expect that you were just going to step into that new role. So she had all these different roles in her life, from HR to logistics to biochemistry, whatever. They're like, here, do it, And all of them reported for themselves and for people they knew who had also come out of the military, that same ridiculously hard transition to step back into this culture in the United States and find anything that had meaning or purpose, including, a tale about one gentleman, high-level special ops, comes out, has all this, extraordinary talent and skill. He's got a really good sales job now, but, he reported to his friend, he said, yeah, this doesn't have any meaning. I'm making money, but this, I don't get it. There's no point to this, right? And so I think that's what you're getting at here, which is to say that if you had this social structure where whatever it might have been, say a Rotary Club, an Elks Club, a bowling league, but there was a point to it and it had meaning and it had purpose, and we could get that from our engagement. Right now, I would say that, based on the stats I'm looking at, the social engagement is kind of at multi-generational lows, I would have to think, whether it's church attendance or I guess even these various clubs, like I just mentioned, Rotary and whatnot. I think those are all kind of reporting diminished attendance at this point, I think.
Right. And a lot of people have tried to explore why this is. I mean, the famous book Bowling Alone by Putnam. And there's been other commentators which have had insights on this. I think, in my personal opinion, the most powerful trend is the government now is everything to everyone. In other words, it's your source of income if you're out of work or you're disabled, or indirectly or directly, it's your livelihood. It's also telling you how to live and what to do, and so everything now comes through the government. In other words, if you want something done, you have to go lobby your local government or whatever. And in the past, when the government had a smaller footprint, by government I mean all layers of government, the federal, the state, and the local, then people relied on social organizations for welfare. In other words, you joined a social welfare group and you put up a little bit of dues, and people in need in that organization then received those funds. And then if you had a bit of hard luck, then you could draw upon that as well. And so if we had to do a Venn diagram of people's sort of engagement with the world, their engagement with the government was basically near zero. Like, say, I'm thinking about the late 1800s, say, right. the Gilded Age, the boom of railroads, mining, expansion, blah, blah, which was a time of widespread prosperity in between the busts, right? The booms and the busts. But people's interaction with the government was basically zero. There was no income tax. And, you really didn't deal with the law unless you were engaged in some sort of really obvious criminal activity. Otherwise, the government was not a part of your life. And your social engagement was all with the community. And now it's sort of reversed. Everybody's engagement is almost 100% with the government. The government dominates the entire structure of society, and all interactions are mediated by the government. In other words, you want to make it easier to ride a bicycle in your town? Well, you got to go through the government. Why join a bike club? What are we going to do? We need to lobby the government, and then we need to lobby the government for government money, which is basically taking away money from some other taxpayer, right? Or we're borrowing it into existence, right? And so I think we've really skewed something in that we've allowed a lot of control and the narrative to be centralized by people who are actually self-serving. It's not really serving the community, it's really serving themselves. And so all these kind of centralized things are actually organized around protecting some elites, take of the situation. Another thing I wanted to mention was, I think we've also gotten caught up in this thing that we're all individuals. We're atomized individuals in a consumer society. And so the only way we can get any engagement is to take a selfie and post it on social media, right? Or we put up a positive facade. And I read this very tragic account, and maybe you did too, in the Boston Globe newspaper, about a teen who committed suicide, again, as so often is the case, out of the blue, no warning signs, and had a positive facade. In other words, she seemed to be doing well at school and seemed to be happy and all that stuff. And that's kind of the way that we're going as a society. Is there's huge pressure on us to put up a positive facade as opposed to actually developing social engagement.
Yeah, a bunch of great points in there. And so let me start with the government side, sort of this outsourcing. This reminds me of another Charles Eisenstein, interviewed a while back, and he's got a whole piece on the gift economy and talking about how a way to begin to correct some of these things is to find things that we currently pay money for that we used to get for free, including childcare from net relatives and entertainment with music on the porch, all of that. So this is sort of poking into this idea that what we've done is we've become atomized, isolated, all of that. At the same time, they were busy posting happy pictures to Instagram saying, look at this amazing meal I just had in this beach, and as we know from the work of Brene Brown, she talks about vulnerability, isolation, shame, all of these things, and basically says that that the key to really being connected to other humans is the exact opposite of creating the facade. It's about being vulnerable. It's about actually sharing. It's about letting people really see what's in there. And that was something that I think, the reason we had that such a rich response, and thank you for characterizing it so beautifully, in the comment section, was I was bearing my heart there. I'm saying, hey, I'm feeling some grief here. I consider myself relatively observant and connected to the natural world, and I'm of an age where the level of baseline decline from when I was a kid to today is astonishing, terrifying, ridiculously fast, and I'm sadder for it, and I would love to reverse that. So if we were going to unpack this and we're going to get back, sort of connect the, hey, we've outsourced everything to basically a bunch of bureaucrats, and we know we want to be more connected and we're being less connected. Charles, how do we go about beginning to reverse that? What are some steps that we can be taking here?
How do we go about doing that? And I'll start out by saying there's no easy way, because I think the social networks we've discussed have been eroded to the point where there's a loss of memory of how they even work. And so when you go to a lot of these traditional social clubs, like and organizations like, say, the Rotary Club, it's for small business people, and a lot of people use it as sort of a real life LinkedIn. Like you're going to meet all these other small business people. But the age, it depends on your club, right? You might be in a place where a lot of young people have been recruited successfully, but I think as a generality, a lot of these traditional social groups, the age skew is like to baby boomers. People in their 50s and 60s and 70s are members, and there's very few people in their 20s. And so if you're under the age of, say, 40 or 50, you may not have any experience at all of any social group that's not run by a corporation or by the government. And so, in other words, a corporate thing might be Weight Watchers. Well, that's better than nothing, right? I mean, it is very helpful to meet other people trying to, get control of their diet and fitness. And so I'm not belittling Weight Watchers, but it is a for-profit corporation. And so that's a little different than, say, a group that doesn't have profit as its primary motivator. And so how do you start a group? Well, I think the one positive trend that I see that is one opportunity is having to do with food and gardening. In other words, there's often a gardening group or a community garden that somebody in the government allowed or created, right? So that you can join, you can get your little garden plot, and then you're starting to interact with other people, or giving away food that's in excess, right? I mean, there's a lot of programs where they're gathering food that's still good and distributing it to people in need, and so there's that, and farmers markets. That's one of the few things I've seen that have emerged where they didn't exist before. And so somebody put in the grunt work and got the farmers market going. And so those are positive trends. And so it's like, what can we learn from that and apply it to other parts of our lives, and try to rebuild some of these community organizations. And just to kind of mention, one of the other themes you brought up, which was scarcity and abundance and regenerative and extractive. And I think a lot of our demoralization and depression arises from the fact that deep down we know we're just extracting. We're not really adding or regenerating, right? And so it's sort of as a base point. I think that if an organization, if you're going to start an organization or be one of the founding members, if people can get the feeling right away that this is regenerative, it's going to make a huge difference in terms of the enthusiasm of people who are going to come in and join you.
And certainly there's an entire movement of mostly younger folks who are, going back to small scale farming and really with the intention of being regenerative about it, not just to, be a small farmer who's basically mining macro and micronutrients, but really tending the soil and closing the loops and flows of all the nutrients and improving. Like it's a win-win-win. I'm earning a living, the soil is getting better, and people are eating healthier food. And that has meaning. That has real meaning and purpose, and it's complex and it's hard work and it's worthy and all of that. Whereas, I could easily understand being demoralized. I was reading this account, Charles, of a farmer in the Central Valley, which basically is 4 inches of rain a year. So it's all irrigated, and they're salting the earth because the irrigated water has trace amounts of salt in it. But over time, you evapotranspirate enough water with salt in it, and guess what? You got salt in the soil. And this farmer knew, the third generation farmer, he said, I don't think this is going to 4 because my grandpa, my dad, and I, we've ruined this soil. And he knew that, and he was still farming and felt demoralized about it. Of course. How, imagine being trapped in a system where you're basically ruining the thing that you should be caretaking. I can't imagine anything a lot more demoralizing than that. But of course, the farmer has that direct frontline experience of that. It's harder for the person living in an apartment in a city to sort of feel that connection. But if you just crack the newspaper, you understand you are part of this larger thing called humanity. And here are the things we are doing. So, to get past that, I think we have to really begin to understand how is it that our actions are moving things away from simply extractive and back towards regenerative. And listen, buying and eating organic food so you're not contributing to the neonicotinoid, insect die-off Armageddon that's happening, that's a good idea. Supporting your local farmers who are farming in the ways that you would like to support by buying their food, even if it's more expensive than the stuff you would get at the Safeway or the Big Y. Yep, that's stuff you can do. Growing your own, or even if you have any plot of land and you don't want to have a garden, but take the plants that are doing nothing essentially and replace them with things that are great for birds and pollinators, and you can use your intelligence to make any plot of land far more abundant than nature will alone, left to its own devices, because, hey, that's a great way to bring our intelligence into this. Those would be sort of like personal individual things anybody could do just related to that one idea of how is it that my eating can contribute to either extraction or regeneration.
Right. And I guess my thought on this whole context that you've created is, if you can share that experience of doing your little part, in other words, instead of just keeping that to yourself,
right,
that you accomplish that in your garden, if you could share that, then you get positive feedback, and then you encourage other people and to do the same thing. And so there's that social element that's lacking, and I want to kind of go back to that. And there's a couple of built-in human conditions or genetic narratives, if you will, that we can build on. One is family. Like when you mentioned Charles Eisenstein's gift economy, if you look at like larger family networks of extended families, and I am connected to one through my wife's family in Hawaii because that's of that culture, and people tend to stay in one place there. The families haven't necessarily spread all over the U.S. like many other mainland families, but it's like abundance. In other words, your tree's loaded with fruit. You call up all your cousins and stuff, or second cousins. I mean, we're talking about a network that extends to dozens upon dozens of people, and then your friends. And so you're giving away your abundance. And then you're making this positive social connection. And of course, the feedback is they're delighted with whatever you were able to provide them, and then if they had too much, then they gave it to their friends, right? And so then this abundance spreads out through the network, and then other people will respond, like when they've made an extra pot of chili or something like that, then guess what? You're going to get some. And so the family network is huge. And when I look at why our society is so ill, why it's so sick, and it's the natural world, but it's also the inner human world. Our culture is ill. It's like family's been depreciated and demoralized too. A lot of people don't get along with their families, and they don't have any family connections, or they see their relatives, once every few years or something. And of course, that's it's understandable in the economy we have, where people are always moving around, and you have to move for your job, or you have to move for your kids' schools, or there's a dozen reasons why you've got to move far away, and then you lose your makes it more difficult. But it is a core factor. And then the other thing is values and faith. And, we don't talk about faith because that means, it's religion, off the topic. Can't talk about it. We're going to offend somebody. But I don't care what faith you have. That's a huge factor in community and social engagement. And like for my own personal experience, when I was younger, I was very active in the American Friends Service Committee, which is the sort of social action arm of the Quakers. And those experiences were like just primary. I mean, they were primary in my life, because you're acting on faith with other people. And I want to include values in here, because there's a lot of like artist communities that have a strong sense of values that acts as sort of a replacement, if you will, for faith, right? In other words, a strong belief in a value system will allow you to congregate around things. And for artists, it's like just finding a cheap place to live and share my art with other people who are excited about doing their art. That's the value system, and I will sacrifice everything else to support this. And so I don't know if I'm being clear about this, but I think those are the sort of anchors or magnets for social engagement, right? You got to have faith or value, something you really value and you're willing to sacrifice for. And you find other people in the same boat. You're going to have something that's really exciting and positive, and everyone's going to get positive feedback when they join.
That's a great set of points, and it reminds me of a conversation I had last year with a good friend of mine who's a little unconventional. Did a lot of Burning Man kind of stuff and involved in fairly experimental sort of social structures and whatnot. So fairly, creative and risk-taking sort of person, socially speaking. And he had been involved in a variety of so-called intentional communities or intentional households and whatnot. And I'm always, interested in that, because we get that question a lot from people like, hey, I feel like I want to go belong to part of a community, maybe even an intentional one. What should I be looking for? And he gave me a piece of advice or an observation of his that I thought it really stuck. Sometimes when somebody tells me something, Charles, I can tell it just goes right in. I'm like, oh, that was important. And so I was asking him about it, and he said, the chance of survival for an intentional anything, household, neighborhood, community, is actually quite low. And in his experiments and observations, he discovered that when these communities get around and organize around agreements, they never work, right? So, we might all say, oh, we're all going to agree that, we think farming is important, and we're going to have a little community garden, and we're all going to agree to keep the kitchen a certain way, whatever, cleanliness, whatever the agreements are. He said instead, the only ones he's seen that were durable were, to your point, they shared values. Because an agreement is only good until the shit hits the fan, and then you find out what's actually under there. And if you don't have the same values under there, it just doesn't work out. So, when I was looking at this, I realized probably the most resilient community I've seen is the Mormons. Adam and I had a couple opportunities. We were out in Salt Lake City. We got the big tour of, their massive granaries, which, could feed every Mormon in the world for a year if necessary. And the fact that the Mormons have their own resilience built into every basement, having food and all of that. But the thing that really caught me was we were taken to just imagine like a really well-packed, well-stocked shopping grocery store. And you walk in there and it's just people pushing around carts and just grabbing stuff and putting, all of that. But what was happening was there was no money involved. That these were all people who had fallen down on hard times, and they walked into the store with a chit from the bishop of their ward, where it was just a piece of paper that said, this person needs groceries. And so they would hand that chit in and just walk around and fill up their carts and walk out. And so where did all those groceries come from? Well, in the value system of the Mormons, they give up one meal a week. Say it's lunch Friday. They skip it. And then what that food would have cost them, whether they were eating out or preparing it, they sort of calculate that, put a few dollars and some coins in a little envelope, and that goes into the collection tray. And then all that money funnels up and it funds this store. So that's the way that they, aren't relying on the government. They're taking care of their own. They are, if you know that you're part of a social network, and when you're down on your luck and you need help with groceries, you go and you get them, knowing that you're going to contribute back into that system at some future point. So you become tied to that. And they had a value system that said, this is important enough to us that we're going to give up one meal a week each, and we're going to contribute into this. And that's why that works, right? Because they have the shared value. It's got a lot of social cohesion, and it's all done by volunteers. And I was really taken by it. I was envious of it. I was like, that's really cool. It was a great example.
Yes, and to your point about the difficulties in intentional communities, I discovered a trend called cohousing, which was fairly new in the late 80s when I was writing about it, because there was a couple, American couple who had visited Denmark, where cohousing is a long-term trend, and they had gone over there to absorb like how it worked. And they brought the model back to the U.S. and started in the Bay Area here in California. And I got very interested in it and discovered that it's for the same reason you just described. It often degrades to sort of a minimal standard of engagement. In other words, people are idealistic about it, but it's you can have ideals that you feel are expressions of your values, but your values are only expressed by what you sacrifice for. And I think this is one of the things that was in Sebastian Junger's book, and that you just mentioned, that the core here to the part of the Mormon food bank that you describe is you sacrifice something. You sacrifice a meal, you go hungry for a couple hours, you pony up some bucks. That's what funds it. So if in our society, why we're ill is if convenience is our new God. Convenience is our religion. And that's our idea of progress is, well, if it's more convenient, it must be better. Mm-hmm. But of course, everything valuable is totally inconvenient. Like you want to learn to play music? It's super inconvenient, okay? It's the most inconvenient thing on the planet. You want to become fit? There's no convenience at all in fitness. It's brutal, okay? And I say this as somebody who's 64 years old, and I can still lift a lot of weight and blah, blah, but it's because I'm doing everything that's absolutely inconvenient, right? I mean, denying myself that second scoop of ice cream, really horribly inconvenient. Mm-hmm. And I can go on. And every form of social engagement we're talking about is inconvenient. It's like, oh, it's dark and it's cold. I don't feel like going out. Guess what? The meeting starts at 7. Or, gosh, it's Saturday morning and I volunteered for the work crew and I really wish I could just like lay here for another hour, but I got to get up. Totally inconvenient. Sacrifice, yes, 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 yes. All sacrifices. But that's what gives it the meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that paradoxical? You would think that ease and leisure would be the gold standard, because of course if we had ease and leisure we would have time to really self-improve and reflect and do all sorts of great stuff. But if we use that leisure time to basically be lazy time, which is what a lot of it devolves into sometimes for people, and then there's no meaning or purpose in that. So I think that's a great point, this idea of sacrifice. And that, yeah, anything that's truly worthwhile really, required effort, sacrifice, right? This is why I think this is like, I mean, this is a trite example, but I think people get close to the mark when they decry the so-called participation trophies, right? Everybody gets a trophy, whether you won or you lost, right? And so it really degrades the experience for the person who really put the effort in and, went out and earned, the top trophy, the top spot, because that's what they strove for. That's what they sacrificed for. But it's also degrading and demeaning for the person who did nothing to be recognized for that. I think that's actually erosive when you get right down to it. And so, but somehow I think, if I was going to, cast a judgment, I think you're right. I think our culture has really lionized this idea of convenience, like that's like anything that's inconvenient is an affront to your cultural mores. Oh my God, my plane is 10 minutes late. It's going to take an hour to, recover from that insult. Right. So yeah, I think there's something to that. So where and how do people get the like where I've heard your, place of sacrifice and, for myself, I've got every year, like gardening it's not easy. No, it takes a lot of work. And I put it in, and you know why I'm doing it? It's fun. I don't do it so that I necessarily can eat. I'm actually planting so that I just know that somebody's going to eat it, whether it's a bird, a raccoon, me, the neighbor. I don't care. I'm doing it because it's my value system says I want to make the area around myself as beautiful and as productive as I can. Yeah, no, and that's huge. And two quick points. One is when you create a garden or you beautify your property with some flowers, which are basically, we go, oh, flowers. Well, wait a minute. Flowers are pollination. That's how we get pollinators. That's how we feed them. So flowers are essential. They're not just some prettifying thing that blue-haired ladies, think about. No, they're like core, and they also beautify. When I have all of my flowers out there blooming, people stop. People look. They see a rose, they see poppies, they see all this stuff. They stop. They can't help it. We're drawn to that kind of natural beauty. So if we create that, then guess what? You'll see your neighbor up the street start planting something, or maybe they'll repaint their ugly falling down fence or something. And so it is just as the broken window syndrome, where neighborhoods go downhill, neighborhoods go uphill in the same fashion, right? Somebody does something that beautifies and makes us respond positively. And growing things and flowers are what we respond to. We don't respond to a new concrete slab. That's right.
And so the other thing I want to mention is there's, we know the term of food desert. That's where, deprived neighborhoods don't have any fresh food outlets, right? So then the people's diet is horrible because they have to take a bus and all this other complicated stuff in order to get to someplace and buy fresh food. So we also have social deserts, and I've a lot of people are occasionally people will ask me, well, I don't know anybody. I live in an American suburb and it's like dead, right? I mean, it's dead at multiple levels, and so. The answer is to move. In other words, you have to go somewhere where there's people of like-minded values, and so it can be a real mind blower when you go to some place and you go, God, it just feels like home. Like there's people that are doing the same kind of stuff and excited about the same kind of stuff I am. And to me, there's nothing. One of the most depressing things I ever saw or experienced was in a gated community. And it wasn't an super high end. It was the kind of faux gated thing for the middle class that, the aspirational middle class that wants to feel like they've really made it. So then, and it's a bunch of stucco boxes with a manicured thing and rules against leaving parked cars in your driveway. And, the usual America suburb thing. Rules. You can only paint your house beige. And you go into the golf club and it's like this empty cavern. And there's a TV with some commercials running. And it was like, and this is supposed to be the American dream. And I thought, this is the most depressing space I've ever been in. And so I think that if you have a response to in an empty golf club in a gated community like I did, then you're in the wrong place. You're not going to find people with the same values and faith that you have. You're going to have to move. And so, and that's a horrendous, talk about inconvenient. I mean, moving is like up there with death and divorce in terms of the toll it takes on your life, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to do it. And if you want to find home, meaning home where you can actually engage people and you're not rolling a stone uphill all the time, right? You're actually finding places where you can join and not have to start the whole thing yourself. The other point I wanted to make was, if you get like-minded people together, then a lot of good things can happen. And here's a quick example. My father's church in Pasadena, when he was alive, it was losing membership, like a lot of old line churches, old line Protestant churches. And so they were thinking of as the population that attended the church died off, then they were thinking, well, we'll just have to sell the church. If we don't have enough people here to support this church. And then a group of young families, people in their late 20s, early 30s with kids who were seeking a church that they could make their own, came in, and it was all like, hey, why don't you guys just take over this church? And so they did. And so they hired their own pastor who was young, energetic, willing to do all the things that older pastors sometimes aren't, which is like recruiting families and thinking of activities for kids and all of that kind of stuff. And so that this group came in and was able to basically take over a failing institution that needed new blood. And so there may be opportunities like that everywhere in the country, that as the old organizations are eroding, a group of young people can come in and refashion that institution to fit their needs. And then it's a really positive feedback.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And this idea of a social desert to accompany the idea of a food desert. Charles, when I was 18, I read a book that had a really large impact on me. It was called Lame Deer, Seeker of Visions. And it's a book written about one of the last Sioux medicine men. And he, was sort of recounting his observations of both native life and as well as, Whitey and what this new culture was all about. And so I think he was probably alive during the late 1800s, early 1900s. Anyway, he said one part, he's like, you guys call yourselves consumers. And he said, I can't think of anything more degrading, but you call yourselves that and you live into that. And so in our pursuit of this idea of creating great places so that we can all be awesome consumers, I'm thinking of the time I was at Glenn Beck's studios and Adam and I were having discussions with his organization. We're in Irving, Texas. This is a suburb of Dallas, or whatever you call it. It's like its own metropolis, but it's outside of Dallas. And just trying to get from our hotel across the 8-lane sort of road, which wasn't a highway. It was just sort of how they do it in Texas. Everything's kind of like multi-lanes. There was no way for a pedestrian to go from across that road safely, right? And so we'd created this sort of consumer paradise where you get in your car, you drive to any one of these, strip mall areas, and it's absolutely devoid of meaning, engagement. It's hostile to pedestrians. It's in the interest of being good consumers, look what we had to give up, And that always stuck with me, that idea that to call yourself, hey, we consumers, that's, you might as well call yourself, an earthworm or something, at least, but earthworms have a role. So I don't know. It's one of those interesting things. So to get back at like, how do we reclaim that? There are movements out there, talking with James Howard Kunstler, and I met a good friend of his, this guy, Robert Davis, who planned a complete community down in Seaside, Florida. His grandfather had a big tract of land somehow, and so built an intentionally constructed town from the ground up. And, hearing all the things that they had done, which was all around how do we build so that the the built environment, it's called new urbanism as a movement. How do we do that so that that built environment increases our chances for social connection? The surface area of our bubbles have more chances of coming up against each other. And is just one example. They had built the school in town with the rec lawn on the front of the school, so that when the kids are out playing soccer, the town can see, like you're going by, there's the school. They're not hidden in a field in the back. They're right out front. And then that field is used for other purposes by the community. And the kids in this particular school system, when they have projects, for recess, they're just let go. They're just rewilded, like off you go, and they go do stuff outside somewhere and come back. And so it's just a very different sort of an approach, but it was built around the idea of saying, how do we build our environment so that it supports who we are as humans, not as consumers? And that's how I would contrast, say, Seaside with Irving.
Yeah, and I think that that's an excellent point. And to go back to your initial question at the start of our discussion was, what's our narrative of action? And so I think that you've just made point one, and then we've talked about, focus on whatever you can do to support regenerative actions, share whatever abundance you have in your life, and try to find, reach out to people who share your values, as opposed to built around like a legalistic agreement.
Right. And be willing to take the sacrifice or the inconvenience that's required to go and sit through a meeting at a Rotary Club where perhaps they have a speaker who's long-winded and not interesting, or whatever the sacrifice is that you have to go through, or understanding that working with groups of people is by definition not very efficient way to get things done sometimes.
No, and it's often a real grind because somebody's on their high horse and wants the group to do something they think is valuable, and then there's a few nutty members, and the positive, when things click, and they always do every once in a while, then you go, wow, you can't replace this feeling of contributing, and we actually got it done.
Yeah,
and you did something good in the community. It's a pretty special thing, and that's what you can never get as a consumer. You can only get that sugar high of I bought something, and then you get the sugar high quickly degrades. You might be excited for like the first time you use it or something, and then like very quickly you habituate to it, and it's like nah. Then you have to re-hit that high with that sugar high with buying something else. But the community or organizations and involvement and engagement we're talking about, it's a level of experiential meaning that is irreplaceable. You can't really replace it with consumerism, and that's kind of like what we've been discussing.
Right. So, I'm really quite honored that these last few pieces I put out touched something, and I think it speaks to this idea that we all know that we need to be more regenerative and more abundant. It's creating rather than extractive and degenerative and all that, or around scarcity, I should say. So given that, and given that there's all this energy, and knowing that we need to really begin pushing in this direction, I think the invitation I would be putting out here to myself, and if this resonates with anybody listening, maybe you too. So I think I'm inspired now by you, Charles, to go and find some new, already existing gathering in my town, and just go feel it out, check it out, see what they're up to, and just use that as a way of engaging further.
Yeah. That's always the easiest thing, and it might be, you have to try a couple different places, and some will not spark you, and or that they won't give you that sense of positive feedback, but then you just keep trying something else, or worst comes to worst, you go ahead and try to start something, and I've done that from scratch, like just put an ad out and a bulletin board thing, and then say, hey. Anybody interested in, say, gardening or biking? Hey, come to the library meeting room at noon on Saturday, or something like that. And then you never know. Sometimes something starts from that. So, anyways, I feel inspired also just to kind of make sure that I strengthen the family network that we have and my network of friends. In other words, just strengthen what you already have is a pretty good start.
Absolutely. Oh, no, great point and advice there as well. So with that, as we wind this down, I'm just, thinking that, where I go with this is I have to just keep pushing this message out because, listen, as I sometimes say, I might be wrong, but I'm not confused. All of the data I have, Charles, says that we're heading towards an ecological nightmare at some point, and it'll be on, maybe it'll be all the way down to the level of human survival. If the rain stopped falling, we have 3 bad harvests in a row worldwide. That's pretty dire sort of a circumstance. So maybe that happens. But what I'm actually talking about is just the steady erosion and loss of the ecology and the ecosystems, which in economic terms, we're going to discover at some point they perform valuable services for free, which when they go away, you suddenly discover they weren't how valuable they were. And as a quick aside, I chuckle every time when the people say, oh, bees perform $28 billion of pollination services. I'm like, oh, no, it's not 28 billion, people. It's infinite. It's infinity monies. Because if the bees went away, you'd discover you couldn't possibly get pollination done for the tidy sum of 28 billion. It would be impossible. So it's actually a service that cannot be measured in that way, shape, or form. But we're quickly losing, whole swaths of critical ecosystems and species, and nature's abundant and she's resilient. It's just that when she decides to pop back with that void that's missing because fish are no longer there, and all of a sudden you have an ocean full of jellyfish instead, or the insects have disappeared, and now you've got this weird fungus showing up that, is now a giant problem. So something will always step in to fill the void. But, we really, in my world, we humans, we shouldn't be messing with things we don't understand. And we should be also preserving them just because they're intact and beautiful and exquisite just the way they are. It feels... It kind of feels like, we live in a big old rickety sort of a house, and we're busy just sort of sawing through timbers, but we don't understand a joist from a beam, from a pillar. It's just a lack of knowledge of the house in which we live, and busy just sort of knocking elements out. Just doesn't feel smart to me. So with that, I say, we need to do new things. We need individuals to begin to step up in their own lives to become more aligned with that idea of regeneration and abundance, and people want to do that. There'll be more meaning and purpose, but first we have to break out of the, I don't even know what to call it, the force field of alternative reality bubble that we've been sort of conditioned into. You're a consumer, you need a job, this is what's important to you, and of course none of those things really turn out to be all that important at the end. So how do we go about, for ourselves, rebuilding the kind of lives that really serve us and allow us to navigate towards a future we can believe in, without which there's no point.
Right. Well, for my final comment would be plant a tree or plant a number of trees. Plant flowers, plant vegetables, plant stuff for pollinators, create an ecosystem in your own little patch of the earth, however small it might be, and then share what you grow. And there's really amazing stuff happens when you take free food or something you've baked with the output of your tree to your neighbor. I mean, you've brightened somebody's day, and you get a hit that it's like it cannot be measured in terms of consumerism. There is no equivalent. So, yeah, get out there, plant stuff, and then share it, and you're going to get some positive feedback that's going to brighten your life and as well as the recipient's life.
Absolutely. So let's all do that. I'm about a month away from having overt abundance coming out of my garden, which I will share with the people who live across the road from me who have bad sunlight just by the quirk of geography, but they wish they had better sunlight. So I've got the sunlight, and I'll be sharing that with them. So with that, Charles, thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you, Chris.